The world is watching, some with excitement, others with dread. The moment Donald Trump stepped back into the Oval Office, something shifted, not just in Washington, but across the country. The energy in the air is different. It's heavier, charged with tension and uncertainty. To some, his return is a victory, a second chance to make America great again. To others, it's a warning sign, a signal that democracy itself is standing on shaky ground. But beyond the debates and headlines, one question lingers. Are we witnessing the rise of an oligarchy in America? Picture this: a lavish ballroom in Palm Beach, Florida. Gold-plated chandeliers cast a warm glow over a room filled with some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the country. The clinking of champagne glasses, hushed conversations behind closed doors, deals being made with just a handshake. These are not elected officials. They are billionaires, corporate moguls, media tycoons, the real power players, the ones who pull the strings from behind the curtain. Now shift the scene to a small town in Ohio. A middle-class family sits at their kitchen table, bills stacked high, their paychecks stretched thin. The cost of everything has gone up: gas, groceries, rent. The American dream feels further away than ever. They turn on the news and hear that the stock market is soaring, that the wealthiest Americans are thriving. But what about them? Who is looking out for the people who don't have a seat at that Palm Beach table? This is the divide, the struggle between power and the people, and it's not new. History tells us that when wealth and influence become too concentrated in the hands of a few, democracy begins to erode. It happened in Russia. It happened in 20th century Europe. Could it be happening here now in the United States? During his first term, Trump's presidency was defined by his unconventional style, his willingness to break norms, and his ability to command loyalty from a dedicated base. But something is different this time. He's not just back in office, he's back with a mission. The institutions that once stood in his way, weakened. His allies, stronger, wealthier, more emboldened than ever. His critics, branded as enemies of the state. The rulebook that governed American politics for decades, tossed aside. And then there's the Supreme Court, reshaped in his image. Congress, where his allies push through policies that favor the ultra-rich. The media landscape shifting, with billionaire-backed networks controlling the narrative. Even social media platforms, once battlegrounds for open discussion, are being influenced by those with deep pockets. Every piece of the puzzle is falling into place, leading to a system where money equals power and power goes unchecked. But how did we get here? And more importantly, where does this lead? The warning signs have been there. In his speeches, Trump has openly praised leaders who consolidate power. He's made it clear that he admires strength, control, and absolute loyalty. He talks about retribution, about settling scores, about draining the swamp. But in this new era, who exactly is being drained, and who is being elevated? Behind closed doors, decisions are being made that will impact millions. Policies that favor a select few, laws that make it harder for the average person to have a say, protections that once kept the wealthy from buying political influence, stripped away. The rise of oligarchy isn't about one leader, it's about a system, an ecosystem where billionaires and political elites work together, not for the people, but for their own interests. The signs are subtle at first. A tax cut here, a media buyout there, more private wealth funneled into elections, more public institutions gutted from the inside. Little by little, the balance of power shifts, not toward the people, but toward those who can afford to control it. And yet, through all of this, there is something that remains: the will of the people, the belief that democracy, real democracy, isn't just about who sits in the White House, but about the voices of everyday Americans. The question is, will those voices be heard, or will they be drowned out by the growing force of money, influence, and unchecked power? As the weeks and months unfold, the stakes will become clearer. Policies will be put in place. The economy will shift. The political landscape will change in ways we may not yet fully understand. But one thing is certain: we are living in a moment that will define the future of American democracy. So, is this the rise of an oligarchy, or is it something else entirely? That's the question we'll explore, because the answer isn't just about Trump. It's about all of us. And what happens next? That's up to history to decide. The warning signs didn't come all at once. They appeared gradually, like cracks in a foundation, small at first, easy to dismiss. A shift in the way policies were written. A quiet reshuffling of key positions in government. An executive order that, on the surface, seemed routine, but in reality handed more power to a select few. The changes didn't scream for attention, they whispered. And by the time people started to notice, it was already too late to stop the momentum. Take the courts, for example. Over the years, the judiciary had been a battleground, one that Trump and his allies played strategically. By his second term, the federal bench was packed with judges loyal to a specific vision of America. Many of them, young and ideologically aligned, would shape the nation's legal landscape for decades. They weren't just interpreting the law, they were redefining it. One by one, regulations that kept corporate power in check or rolled back. Laws that once protected everyday Americans from economic exploitation were weakened. And when challenges arose, when lawsuits threatened to expose what was happening, the courts, now controlled by judges sympathetic to the administration, stood firmly on the side of the powerful. Meanwhile, Congress, supposedly the voice of the people, became something else entirely. Behind closed doors, deals were being made. Lobbyists for major corporations wielded more influence than elected representatives. Policies that would make life easier for the average American, lower drug prices, higher wages, affordable health care, were left to gather dust. Instead, new tax breaks for the wealthiest were fast-tracked. Regulations were stripped down under the promise of economic growth. And while the rich celebrated their skyrocketing fortunes, working families saw little change in their day-to-day struggles. In the media, the shift was more subtle but just as dangerous. Traditional journalism, once a watchdog against corruption, found itself under siege. Major networks and newspapers that had once been critical of Trump's policies saw their ownership change hands. Billionaires aligned with his vision quietly bought up shares, reshaped narratives, and steered public perception in a different direction. Stories that exposed the growing influence of money in politics. Buried. Reporters who refused to fall in line. Silenced or pushed out. On television, social media, and news websites, a new reality was being constructed, one that blurred the lines between fact and fiction, between truth and propaganda. And then there were the billionaires, the real architects of this transformation. Not the ones on television or Twitter making flashy statements. The ones who operated in the shadows, who understood that real power wasn't about winning elections, it was about controlling the system itself. These were the people funding super PACs, pouring millions into campaigns, shaping laws that benefited their own interests. They didn't need to hold office, they only needed to control those who did. Take one man, for example, an energy tycoon with a vast fortune and an even bigger influence in Washington. His company had been fined for environmental violations for years, but under the new administration, those fines quietly disappeared. Instead, he found himself at a private dinner with top officials, discussing policies that would open up more public lands for drilling. His investments skyrocketed, his power grew, and the people who lived in the towns affected by his industry, they had no voice in the matter. Or consider a media mogul who had once been critical of Trump, but now found himself in a position of great opportunity. He saw which way the wind was blowing, and rather than fight it, he embraced it. His news empire shifted its coverage, subtly at first, less criticism, more focus on the failures of the opposition. Soon, his networks became mouthpieces for the administration's messaging, ensuring that dissenting voices were drowned out. And what about the tech billionaire, the one who had once championed free speech and open platforms? Under the guise of fighting misinformation, his company adjusted algorithms, making it harder for independent journalists and smaller news outlets to gain traction. Instead, the voices that aligned with those in power received more visibility. What people saw online, what they believed to be organic, was in fact carefully curated, designed to shape public opinion, to guide conversations in a way that benefited a select few. Meanwhile, for the average American, life continued. The changes weren't always obvious, not at first. They still went to work. They still paid their bills. They still scrolled through their phones, watching the news unfold in quick, digestible clips. But something felt different, a lingering unease, a sense that the system, the very foundation of their democracy, was slipping away from them. It wasn't just about Trump. He was the face of it, the rallying figure, but this wasn't the work of one man alone. This was the slow, deliberate construction of a new kind of power structure, one where democracy still existed in name, but functioned more like an illusion. Elections would still be held. Speeches would still be made. But the real decisions, the ones that shaped the nation's future, would be made elsewhere, behind closed doors, in rooms filled with people whose wealth shielded them from the struggles of everyday life. And yet, even as this transformation took place, there were those who saw it for what it was. Whistleblowers who risked everything to reveal the truth, activists who refused to be silenced, independent journalists who fought to keep real stories in the public eye, everyday citizens who refused to accept that this was just the way things were now. But could they do anything about it? Could they stand against a system that seemed designed to crush dissent before it even had a chance to rise? As the second term unfolded, as policies continued to favor the few over the many, as more power was consolidated into the hands of the elite, one question remained. Was it too late to stop what was happening? Or was this simply the beginning of something even bigger, something that would redefine America for generations to come? The changes were happening so gradually that, to most people, they didn't seem like changes at all. Life continued. The economy moved in cycles. The news was still filled with endless debates, scandals, distractions. It was easy to think that things were normal, but democracy was still intact. But for those who were paying attention, really paying attention, the signs were there. The balance of power had shifted. The government no longer belonged to the people. It belonged to those who could afford it. Among those who saw what was happening was Sarah Whitman, a journalist who had spent years investigating corruption in Washington. She wasn't a TV personality, not one of the loud voices that thrived on controversy. She was a reporter in the trenches, following the money, connecting the dots. And what she was seeing now was unlike anything she had ever covered before. It wasn't just one scandal, one bad law, one corrupt politician. It was an entire system being restructured in real time. She had spent the last 6 months tracing financial records, looking into new laws that had quietly been passed under the radar, tax policies that benefited billionaire donors, government contracts awarded to close allies, industries deregulated in ways that made life easier for the wealthy and harder for the working class. And there was something else, something deeper. A web of influence that stretched from corporate boardrooms to the highest levels of government. The more she uncovered, the more it became clear. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. But getting people to listen was another challenge. The media landscape had changed. Her stories, once widely read, now struggled to gain traction. Editors hesitated before publishing anything too critical. Social media platforms buried investigative reporting beneath a flood of entertainment and outrage-driven content. Even the sources she used to rely on, whistleblowers, government insiders, were growing more cautious, afraid of the consequences of speaking out. Then there was Daniel Foster, a mid-level policy advisor who had worked in Washington for years. He had never been a radical, never considered himself a political activist. He believed in the system, in the idea that government, despite its flaws, was meant to serve the people. But as Trump's second term progressed, Daniel began to see how much had changed. The bills that crossed his desk weren't about helping the public, they were about consolidating power. Laws were being rewritten in ways that benefited corporations, not citizens. And when he raised questions, he was met with silence, or worse, quiet warnings to stay in line. Daniel had access to information that most people didn't. He saw the backroom deals, the policies being shaped by billionaires who had no interest in democracy. He knew the names of the people behind it all, the donors, the lobbyists, the executives who had more influence over government decisions than elected officials. And he knew that if he spoke out, he would lose everything. He wasn't alone in his unease. Across the country, there were people like him, government employees, legal experts, economists, who saw what was happening but felt powerless to stop it. They whispered in private conversations, debated whether it was worth the risk to push back. But the more power was concentrated, the harder it became to resist. Outside of Washington, in places far removed from the halls of power, the effects of these changes were beginning to be felt. In small towns where factories had shut down, where workers had been promised jobs that never came, frustration was growing. People were angry. They had been told that Trump's return to office would bring prosperity, that America would be put first. But for many, life hadn't improved. Wages remained stagnant. Healthcare costs kept rising. Corporations posted record profits while ordinary people struggled to get by. And yet, the message from the administration was clear. Things were better than ever. The economy was booming. Critics were dismissed as radicals, as unpatriotic. Those who protested were painted as threats to stability. And slowly, the ability to challenge power, to even question it, was being eroded. Even in the legal system, things were shifting. New laws made it easier to prosecute journalists who exposed government corruption. Whistleblower protections were weakened. Protest laws were rewritten to impose harsher penalties. Courts, once a last line of defense, were increasingly staffed by judges who saw their role not as upholding the Constitution, but as protecting those in power. And yet, despite all of this, resistance still existed. There were those who refused to accept this new reality. Underground networks of activists, independent journalists, former government officials who had chosen to speak out. They communicated in encrypted messages, met in hidden locations, worked to uncover the truth before it was completely buried. One of them was Alex Carter, a former intelligence analyst who had grown disillusioned with what he saw happening. He had access to information the public didn't, classified documents, internal memos that showed just how much control had been handed over to a small group of elites. He had spent years believing in the system, believing that democracy, for all its flaws, would ultimately prevail. But now he wasn't so sure. He had started leaking information to journalists, including Sarah. He knew the risks. He had seen what happened to others who had done the same. Careers destroyed, lives ruined. But he also knew that if no one stood up, things would only get worse. As Sarah continued her reporting, as Daniel debated whether to come forward, as Alex worked to expose the truth, the question loomed over everything. Was it too late? Could the system still be saved? Or had the country already crossed a line that it could never come back from? Everywhere, the signs of oligarchy were becoming clearer. Billionaires openly influencing policy. Elections that still took place but felt increasingly meaningless. A government that served the interests of the few while silencing the voices of the many. And as the months went on, as more power was consolidated, one thing became certain: whatever was happening wasn't just about Trump. It was about something much bigger. Something that had been in motion for years, long before he took office. He was just the face of it. The real question wasn't whether America was becoming an oligarchy. The real question was whether anything could still be done to stop it. The tension was building. It was no longer just a feeling in the air, a quiet undercurrent of unease. It was real, tangible, pressing down on everything like a storm about to break. People were beginning to notice, really notice, that something was wrong. The gap between the powerful and the powerless wasn't just growing. It was solidifying into something unbreakable. Laws were being rewritten, voices were being silenced, and yet, most Americans were still going about their daily lives, not realizing just how much had already changed. Sarah Whitman felt it every day. The deeper she got into her investigation, the more dangerous it became. Sources who had once spoken freely were now afraid. Some refused to answer her calls. Others warned her that her voice is laced with fear. Asterisk, they're watching. Be careful, asterisk. She had spent weeks piecing together a trail of financial records, hidden contracts, and secret meetings that pointed to something much bigger than she had originally thought. This wasn't just about Trump. This was an entire network of billionaires, corporate leaders, and government officials working together, tightening their grip on the country. And the terrifying part, it wasn't illegal. The system had been rigged in their favor for so long that they didn't need to break the law. They simply changed the laws to fit their needs. Daniel Foster knew it too. Every day, he sat in the same government office, watching policies roll out that he knew were designed to benefit only a select few. He had worked on Capitol Hill long enough to understand the game, but now it wasn't just a game. It was something else entirely. A shift so profound that he wasn't sure if democracy could survive it. His breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. A memo had landed on his desk, a proposal disguised as an economic reform bill. The language was deliberately vague, but the implications were clear. If passed, it would allow private corporations to take over key public institutions, education, infrastructure, even portions of law enforcement. The argument was simple. Private companies were more efficient. But Daniel knew the truth. This was a takeover. A legal, systematic transfer of power from the public to the elite. He hesitated before making the call. His hands were shaking. If he did this, there was no turning back. Sarah answered on the second ring. "I have something you need to see," he said. "Something big." Across the city, Alex Carter was already preparing for the inevitable fallout. He had been leaking information for months, but now it was becoming riskier. More surveillance, more pressure on journalists, whispers that certain people were being watched. He had friends who had already disappeared from public life, laid off, discredited, some even arrested on charges that felt too convenient to be real. He had seen the reports, the classified documents that outlined what was happening behind the scenes. It wasn't just about consolidating wealth, it was about consolidating control. The administration was systematically working to reshape the very foundation of the government. They weren't just rewriting the rules, they were making sure no one else could change them back. The three of them, Sarah, Daniel, and Alex, knew they were running out of time. The final push came when Sarah received an anonymous message. It was short, just a few words. *, meet me. Tonight. Parking garage, 10th Street. Come alone, *. She knew better than to trust anonymous sources without verification. But something told her this was real. The timing, the location, it all pointed to someone who had information but was too afraid to reveal it openly. She had no choice. When she arrived, the garage was nearly empty. A single flickering light cast long shadows across the concrete. Her footsteps echoed as she moved cautiously forward, her pulse pounding. A figure stepped out from the darkness. Hood pulled up, hands buried deep in his pockets. He looked around nervously before speaking. "They know about you," he said. His voice was low, urgent. "They know about everything you've been working on." Sarah's stomach tightened. "They're making moves," he continued, shutting down leaks. "Preparing for," he hesitated, "for something bigger." "What do you mean?" she asked. "I don't know all the details," he admitted, "but I know this. Whatever is coming next, it's already in motion." Sarah pressed for more, but he was already backing away, looking around as if expecting someone to be watching. "Be careful," he said. "They're not just trying to control the system anymore. They're trying to make sure no one can challenge it, ever." And then he was gone. Sarah stood there, her mind racing. If what he said was true, then this wasn't just about money and power anymore. It was about control, absolute, unshakable control. And if they didn't act fast, it might be too late to stop it. Back in Washington, Daniel made a choice. He took the memo, the proof of what was happening, and sent it to Sarah. He knew the risks. He knew what had happened to others who had spoken out. But he also knew that if no one did anything, the America he believed in, The America that was supposed to belong to the people would be gone. Alex, watching from the outside, prepared for what came next. He knew the government's playbook. First, they discredited their enemies. Then, they silenced them. And if that didn't work, they made them disappear. He just didn't know how far they were willing to go. As the days passed, Sarah's article was almost ready. The evidence was clear. The truth was undeniable. But something didn't feel right. Her emails had been glitching. A black SUV had been parked near her apartment for 3 nights in a row. Then, one evening, she got the call. A deep, measured voice on the other end. "You should drop the story," the caller said. No introduction, no explanation, just a warning. Sarah's grip tightened on her phone. "Who is this?" Silence. Then, a low chuckle. "You know who we are," the voice said, "and you know what happens next." The line went dead. Sarah sat there, heart pounding. She looked at the files spread across her desk, the documents, the records, the undeniable proof of everything they had uncovered. And then she realized. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. This was about survival. Because if they were willing to go this far to stop her, what else were they willing to do? Sarah sat frozen, the silence after the call pressing against her like a weight. She had expected pushback, maybe even a smear campaign, but this was different. This was a direct threat. A warning that she had gotten too close, that the people she was exposing weren't just powerful, they were untouchable. She glanced at the files on her desk, the evidence she had spent months collecting. If she published now, it would be undeniable. But what if that was the plan? What if they wanted her to publish, only to discredit her afterward? A perfectly orchestrated trap to make sure no one believed the truth even when it was right in front of them. Her laptop screen flickered. Then suddenly, it went black. A second later, it rebooted on its own. Sarah's stomach clenched. She hadn't touched anything. Then an email notification popped up. No sender, no subject line, just a single word in the body. *stop*. She grabbed her phone and dialed Alex. He picked up immediately. "They're watching me," she said, her voice low. "They just shut down my laptop. Someone hacked it." There was a pause. When Alex spoke, his voice was tight. "Get out of your apartment. Now." Sarah didn't question it. She grabbed her bag, stuffed the most important documents inside, and bolted for the door. The moment she stepped into the hallway, she saw it. A man in a dark suit, standing by the stairwell. His posture was relaxed, too casual. He wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't lost. He was waiting. She didn't stop to think. She turned and took the other exit, her heart hammering as she ran down the stairwell 2 steps at a time. She burst out onto the street and into the crowd, moving fast, blending in. She kept walking, resisting the urge to look back. Alex was already waiting for her at a diner across town. When she slid into the booth, he pushed a burner phone toward her. "Ditch yours," he said. "They've got it tapped." Sarah hesitated for only a second before powering down her phone and stuffing it in her bag. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, his face pale. "They know about me," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Security came to my office today. They said they were doing routine compliance checks, but they went through my files, my emails. They took my work laptop." Sarah exhaled sharply. "This is bigger than we thought." Alex leaned in. "It gets worse." He placed a flash drive on the table between them. "I have proof that this isn't just about controlling policy. It's about rewriting the entire structure of the government." Sarah felt the air shift. "What do you mean?" Alex's eyes flicked toward the window before he spoke. "A new directive is in place, one that would allow private corporations to take over certain federal agencies under the guise of efficiency improvements. This isn't just about deregulation anymore. They're privatizing power itself." Daniel swore under his breath. "That's insane. That would mean elected officials would be nothing more than figureheads." Sarah finished, her stomach twisting. The real power would belong to the people who own the corporations running the agencies. Alex nodded, and it gets even worse. The legal framework is already being drafted. If they succeed, future elections will be meaningless. The system will be locked in, controlled by a handful of elites, and once it's in place, there's no going back. Sarah gripped the edge of the table. This wasn't just corruption. It wasn't just another scandal. This was a hostile takeover of democracy itself. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, looking like he wanted to be anywhere but here. How do we stop this? Sarah's mind was racing. Publishing the story wouldn't be enough, not with how easily they could discredit her, bury the truth beneath a flood of misinformation. They needed undeniable proof, something so big, so irrefutable, that no amount of spin could cover it up. There has to be someone on the inside, she said. Someone who knows everything. Someone willing to come forward. Alex shook his head. No one at that level is going to talk. Not unless they have no choice, Daniel added. That's when it hit Sarah. A second plot was unfolding right in front of them, one that they hadn't seen before. The people behind this power grab weren't just controlling the system, they were silencing anyone who got in their way. And the next person on their list? Sarah. The realization sent a chill through her. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. This was about survival. And if they were going to take this fight to the next level, they had to act fast, before they became the next ones to disappear. Sarah knew they were running out of time. Every second they waited, the grip around them tightened. The people in power weren't just watching anymore, they were moving. The burner phone Alex had given her buzzed on the table. A message flashed on the screen. Asterisk, we need to meet. Now, same place, asterisk, no name, but she knew who it was. The anonymous source. The one who had warned her before. She looked up at Alex and Daniel. This might be our last chance. Alex hesitated. Are you sure it's not a trap? I'm not sure of anything anymore, Sarah admitted. But if we don't go, we lose everything. They left separately, taking different routes to avoid being followed. Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped into the parking garage. The flickering light overhead cast long shadows, making every movement feel like a threat. Then she saw him, the same hooded figure from before, shifting anxiously from foot to foot. He looked around before stepping forward. They're moving faster than I thought, he said, voice low. You don't have days, you have hours. Sarah swallowed hard. Hours until what? The man hesitated. They're shutting it all down. Your article, your access, your records, everything. They've already taken steps to discredit you. By tomorrow morning, you'll be labeled a fraud, a conspiracy theorist. Sarah felt the weight of those words sink in. Then we have to act now. The man nodded. I have one more thing for you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a second flash drive. This is the final piece. It proves everything. The financial transactions, the private meetings, the real names behind the corporations. She took it, her hands shaking. Why are you doing this? He exhaled. Because I believed in the system once, and now I see what's happening to it. A noise echoed from the stairwell, heavy footsteps, more than one person. Go, the man whispered. Now. Sarah turned and ran, gripping the flash drive like a lifeline. She sprinted through the garage, her breath rag. Behind her, the footsteps quickened. She barely made it to the street before a black SUV screeched around the corner. She didn't wait to see who was inside. She bolted down the sidewalk, disappearing into the crowd. Back at Alex's apartment, she burst through the door. We have it, she panted, tossing the flash drive onto the table. This is everything. Daniel was already at his laptop, working around firewalls and security measures to upload the files. They've been trying to shut down our access, but I found a backdoor. Alex nodded. We don't just publish it. We send it everywhere. To every journalist, every watchdog organization, every independent news outlet that still has integrity. Sarah felt the adrenaline surging through her. We don't stop until the truth is everywhere. Daniel hit a key. The files started uploading. "We're in." A tense silence filled the room as they watched the progress bar inch forward. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. This was it, the moment they had been fighting for. And then the screen flickered. The upload stopped. A message popped up. *connection lost*. No, 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 Daniel muttered, typing furiously. They cut the link. Alex's jaw clenched. They were ready for us. A second later, Sarah's burner phone buzzed. A new message. *2 late*. She stared at the screen, ice flooding her veins. They're one step ahead. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Alex stood up. "We're not done." Sarah looked at him. "What do you mean?" He grabbed his laptop. "They shut down our connection, but they can't shut down all of them. We take this to the people ourselves. We go live. We stream it, broadcast it, whatever it takes. We make sure they can't erase it." Daniel nodded. "If we're fast enough, they won't be able to stop the signal before it spreads." Sarah's heart raced. This wasn't the plan, but it might be their only shot. She took a deep breath. "Then let's do it." They set up everything in minutes. Cameras on, mix live, screens filled with the evidence they had uncovered. Sarah took the seat in front of the camera, staring straight into the lens. "My name is Sarah Whitman," she said, voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "And if you're watching this, you need to know the truth." She laid it all out. The corruption, the power grab, the way democracy itself was being rewritten in real time. She showed the documents, the financial records, the undeniable proof of what was happening behind the scenes. Within minutes, the views started climbing. Comments poured in. People were watching. People were listening. Then, just as the momentum was building, the power cut out. Darkness swallowed the room. The hum of electronics went silent. Alex cursed. "They shut us down." Sarah's mind raced. The battery, the backup. Daniel was already on it. Within seconds, the screen flickered back to life, running on emergency power. But the stream was gone. Their connection severed. For a split second, Sarah felt panic. Had they lost? Had they failed? Then Alex's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his eyes widened. "It's out there," he whispered. He turned the screen to show them. The video had been downloaded, copied, shared across countless platforms. It was spreading faster than they could have ever done alone. They hadn't just exposed the truth. They had unleashed it. Sarah exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. "They can't stop it now." Daniel smiled faintly. "They tried to silence us, and it backfired." Outside, the world was already reacting. The cracks in the system were widening. The story was out. The people knew. But just as Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief, a knock sounded at the door. 3 sharp raps, precise, intentional. The room fell silent. No one moved. Alex met Sarah's gaze. "They're here." Sarah's heart pounded. The truth was out. But the fight was just beginning. The knock echoed through the apartment, each second stretching unbearably as Sarah, Alex, and Daniel exchanged tense glances. No one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the backup power keeping their equipment alive. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. They had done it. The truth was out. The evidence was in the public's hands now, spreading faster than anyone could control. But the people they had exposed weren't the kind to accept defeat quietly. Alex exhaled sharply, stepping toward the door, but Sarah grabbed his wrist. She shook her head. Whoever was on the other side wasn't knocking for a friendly conversation. The knock came again, this time more forceful. Daniel's fingers hovered over his laptop, ready to wipe anything sensitive if needed. Sarah's mind raced through options. Running wasn't an option. They were already surrounded. Hiding was pointless. Then, just as Alex reached for the doorknob, something unexpected happened. A phone vibrated on the table. Not theirs, the burner phone. Sarah snatched it up, heart racing as she read the message. Asterisk, do not open the door. Trust me. Wait, asterisk. Her breath hitched. The anonymous source. The one who had given them the last crucial piece of evidence. He was still watching. She lifted her gaze to Alex and Daniel, holding up the phone. We wait, she whispered. The knocking stopped. A long silence followed. Then the faint sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. No one spoke until the tension in the air began to settle. They left, Daniel said, barely believing it himself. For now, Alex muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. Sarah sat down heavily in a chair, exhaustion hitting her all at once. They had been running on adrenaline for so long that the sudden pause felt unnatural. But she knew better than to believe it was over. Daniel turned his laptop screen toward them. Look. The video was everywhere. News networks had picked it up. Social media was flooded with conversations, debates, and outrage. The evidence they had uncovered was no longer just a story, it was a movement. Alex let out a low whistle. We actually did it. Sarah wasn't so sure. We made them react, she said slowly. But what comes next? The system they had exposed wasn't built overnight, and it wouldn't crumble in a day. Those in power would fight back. They would deny, distract, twist the narrative. The machine would keep moving, even if it had been shaken. Daniel refreshed the screen. Government officials are already responding. Some are calling for investigations. Others are saying it's fake news. Sarah expected that. That's just the beginning. Alex sighed. We knew this wouldn't be clean, but at least now, people are questioning. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Asterisk, you need to disappear. Lay low for now. Let the story take its course, asterisk. Sarah knew they were right. If they stayed in the open, they would be easy targets. Their work was done, at least for now. The rest was in the hands of the public, the journalists brave enough to keep pushing, and the officials with enough integrity to act. We need to leave, she said. Split up. Stay off the grid for a while. Alex didn't argue. Neither did Daniel. They had all seen too much to think they could just go back to normal. Sarah stood, grabbing the few belongings that mattered. Before stepping out, she looked at them one last time. No matter what happens, we did the right thing. Daniel nodded. And we're not done. We never will be. Alex gave her a small, tired smile. See you on the other side. With that, they slipped into the night, each heading in different directions. In the days that followed, the country was in turmoil. Protests erupted. Politicians scrambled to control the damage. The people demanded answers. The story had done what it needed to do. It had forced the truth into the light. Whether or not the system would change was another question. But one thing was certain, the illusion of control had been shattered. And somewhere in the shadows, Sarah watched it all unfold, knowing that the fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for now, she had done her part.